don't know about you, but me personally, I am a very curious person by nature. I can't help it. When I am confronted with things in this universe that I don't understand, I absolutely need to seek out more information about those things. And having the answers to those questions is certainly a priority, but sometimes it's just knowing the right question to ask, right? Because the right question to ask about the things that you're curious about just brings up more things to think about, more things for your brain to sort of try to tackle. Now, in this first lecture of the semester, I am going to dive into the origins of human culture. Now, this class is indeed titled Western Literature and the Arts. So we are going to eventually focus on just Western cultures. But when we're talking about the origins of human culture, we kind of all share those. The arts, what would eventually become the written word, those things we all kind of have in common because human beings sort of came from one place tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then spread outward. So when we look at the artifacts and the things left behind from some of those earliest groups of human beings, we're talking about shared ancestors. In this lecture, we'll talk about some of the earliest art to ever be made by human beings. We'll sort of work our way through the prehistoric period and then land finally in ancient history by talking about the first two civilizations ever on this planet. Here's something I want you to think about, just as an entree, if you will, into this lecture. Over the summer, if you are the curious type, you may have seen some of the images that came from the James Webb Space Telescope. Over the summer, NASA released some of the first images from that telescope. The James Webb Space Telescope is an amazing feat of human ingenuity, designed to be able to see and be sensitive to infrared light. And infrared light is a type of light that is outside human visible light. We can't see infrared. And it's a wavelength that is associated with heat. Light that is coming from extremely, extremely far away distances, by the time it reaches us, has lost all but the faintest of infrared wavelengths. And as such, can't be seen by the naked eye, but also can't be seen by telescopes that are made sensitive to infrared light here on Earth, because the Earth itself is a big, gigantic source of heat. So the James Webb Telescope was launched into space, as the name would suggest, but interestingly enough, it was put in orbit around the Earth so far away that it's actually beyond the moon. And it has shielding on the back of it, and it points outward into the depths of space. That shielding on the back, and the fact that it is pointed directly out toward space, away from the Earth and away from the sun, which it keeps behind it, is so that it isn't overwhelmed by the heat signatures of the sun and of the Earth, and of the moon for that matter. That's why it's put way out there. And one of the most fascinating images that came out of it, and this is one that you probably saw, was this one right here. Now this image is one that was taken by pointing out to a portion of the night sky that the way it was described is that if you were standing on Earth and you held a grain of rice between your fingers and held it out at arm's length, you would completely cover up this area right here. It was pointed out toward that particular area of space and took a long exposure. And then the machinery that then reads the information assigns the different wavelengths of infrared certain colors, and then we get an image like this. Now, why is this one so impressive? Well, most of those dots of light that you see within that image are galaxies. They're not just stars, right? They're billions of stars collected and packed into a tiny fraction of what is a tiny fraction of what we can see when we look up at the sky. And I say what we can see because, but that's not true, because most of what's in this image we can't see with our naked eyes when we do look at the sky. But most of these galaxies that we see in this image are so far away. They are believed to be about 13 billion light years away. And the universe itself is believed to be only a little over 13 billion years old. That means that this image is giving us our first glimpses of how the universe may have looked in its very earliest years, right? We've never seen this far back in time, but because it takes the light 13 billion years to reach us, this telescope is able to look back, capture that, is very sensitive to that information, is able to show us what, or at least give us some ideas of how our universe formed. Now, why would I be bringing that up when I'm about to have a lecture on the origins of humans? Well, because I want you to keep in mind that as we're going to look at these very early cultures in human prehistory and eventually ancient history, that it can feel like those people are so far removed from us. But here's the thing. In all these tens of thousands of years since those earliest of humans that we'll talk about at the beginning of this lecture, our brains haven't really evolved all that much. What we have gotten really good at in that time is communal knowledge, right? That we don't have to store everything in our brains ourselves. We can depend upon knowledge that's been gathered by those who came before us. Our brains are the same brains, essentially. And so when we look at the earliest artwork, when we look at some of the earliest civilizations to be built by people working together, I want you to look at those things and keep in mind that the same brains that were in them and that created those things are the same brains in us that created this and can do amazing things like this. This is what we're capable of. So let's start with the origins of humans and see what we can perhaps learn from them about who we are now. Hey everybody, it is week 1 of the spring 2022 semester, and we are going to be diving in this week into the origins of human culture. For me, you're specifically going to be getting information on the arts of the early prehistoric cultures. You'll then, next week, you'll get information on the literature, writing, things of that nature from Professor McIntosh. Let's dive right in. So at the beginning of this semester, I always like to take a look at this particular object right here. This is a piece of engraved ochre that was found in the Blombos cave in South Africa. Now, ochre is a type of mineral. It's got a yellow, like a ruddy yellow color to it, and gets used for a lot of different purposes. This one we cannot know. This was used by far distant prehistoric peoples, and so we cannot know exactly what it was used for. One of its more recent uses is for face paint, and that's what many people assume this was probably used for. With the rock, one might have had the rock in their hands and would have wet a hand and rubbed it against that, pulled up some of that mineral, and then sort of used it as face paint. But we can't know for sure because, as you can see here, this piece of ochre is dated to around 75,000 BCE. Now that C with a period you see before the date there, that means circa. Circa is a Latin word for around, like circa, circle. So around 75,000 years BCE. That's as close as the carbon dating can get us. It can't get us to a precise year. And since we're talking about a date, I also like to spend just a brief moment talking here at the beginning of this lecture about how years are numbered in the system that we use in the Western world. And in the Western tradition, we have a calendar that dates years based on their distance, either since or before the estimated year of Christ's birth. Right? This is a system that was set up a long time ago by people who would have been worshipers of Christ. And so time gets split by these people, right? Into, again, by estimating what would have been the birth year of Christ and designating that year as AD 1. AD stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for the year of our Lord, right? So every year since then has been the year of our Lord, and then the number of years since that first birth year of Christ. So those years count upward. They have done so all the way from AD 1 to now here we are at AD 2022, right? All of the years before this time, right, we're given the designation BC, or before Christ, right? And so these numbers count backward from the estimated birth of Christ. So it's one of those things where I always bring this up because there were I had a couple of students in a course a few years back who were confused by the idea that the years that we look at in this class, for most of this class at least, that they were all counting down instead of counting up that we were accustomed to years doing. And this is because, again, of the system that was set up in place by worshipers of Christ, so that these years before that estimated birth it's exactly what it sounds like, right? It is 500 years before Christ. That's naturally, of course, going to be a much later time than 1500 before Christ, which is 1,000 years earlier, right? So that's the thing to keep in mind, right? The numbers, the BC numbers count down as we get later in time. The years AD count upward as we get later in time. Now, in more recent years, there has been a change in this nomenclature from BC and AD to instead BCE and CE. So we now have the years since the estimated birth of Christ, so 1 through so far 2022, are now referred to as the Common Era. And all of these dates before this are referred to as before Common Era. This is just a means of making this calendar a little more accessible to those who may not be worshipers of Christ. If one is not a worshiper of Christ, it might feel a little weird to refer to a year as the year of our Lord, fill in the blank. All right? So let's come back to this particular piece of ochre. This piece of ochre is dated to about 75,000 BCE. Add to that our 2022 years, and you're getting a piece of ochre that some human being, at least 77,000 years ago, decided to scrap some markings into, right? These markings that you see that are horizontal and diagonal, creating these hatching marks and these diamond shape, these were very intentionally done by a human 77,000 years there, give or take, ago. And this piece of engraved ochre is recognized as one of, if not the earliest piece of artwork that has yet to be found. 77,000 years ago. So art is at least that old. When I was a student in your position back in the 90s, art was only thought to be about 35,000 years ago. Okay? This particular piece of ochre was found in the last 15, 17-ish years and doubled that amount of time.
As it turns out, this may not be the oldest piece of artwork that has been found. We've actually discovered this particularly interesting piece, known as the Venus of Tintin. Now, this piece right here is clearly a carving meant to look like a human being. We've sort of referred to it as the Venus of Tintin. Who knows what it would have been called in the time that it was made. But this piece was created anywhere between 200,000 and 500,000 years ago. Now, pardon my French, but holy shit. I mean, that's that goes way back. We're talking about a time at which this piece very well could have been made by hominids even earlier, before the time of Homo sapiens. We could be talking about Homo erectus, or maybe even an earlier hominid. That puts a new, particularly interesting twist on the origins of art. And it's not the only contender. There's an even older piece that's a bit controversial. There is this piece here known as the Venus of Barakat Ram. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I searched online and found about 3 different ways people were pronouncing it. This particular piece could be anywhere from 230,000 to 700,000 years old. But I said it's controversial because historians and archaeologists are arguing as to whether or not this is actually a piece of art. Certainly to our eyes, this looks vaguely human, shaped. But is it, or is it just a rock that got weathered by erosion over hundreds of thousands of years? So although we can't necessarily say that this piece is the earliest of known artwork that's been found, we at least can certainly point to the Venus of Tintin and say that it pushes the origins of art back hundreds of thousands of years from where we thought it was. Now, that's not going to change anything that I'm about to say. Well, I mean, it changes the fact that I'm going to point out often that this is the earliest known piece of artwork that we know of. But it's not going to change the discussion around why this piece of artwork might have been made But I do want you to understand that where there are some other contenders that push the origins of art even further back than what we originally thought.
And why do we consider this to be a work of art? Why does one look at this in particular and say that it's art? Well, again, it's because of those markings on it that seem to have been done very intentionally, for one, right? This is intentional. Someone has scratched this into the surface of this, right? Intentionally. This isn't something that happened because of natural erosion or something like that. And it doesn't seem to serve any functional purpose. If it was a piece of ochre for face paint, well, scratching the stuff in the side of it doesn't help that, right? It doesn't make it where it's more efficient at being a cake for face painting. If it was used for some other purpose, a weapon or what have you, those marks don't do anything for it. They seem to be decorative. Here's one of the times when I kind of wish we were still in the classroom. Professor McIntosh and I have decided to continue having this course as an online offering. We made the switch to online when the pandemic first began, and we found that we really enjoy teaching this way. And we have found that it is nice to have an option for this course that is not in the classroom. But I do miss some of the interactions, and this is one of them. Whenever I would talk about this particular artifact, I would ask the students in the classroom, why do you think whoever the person was that scratched these marks into this rock, why did that person do it? What could possibly have been their reason for doing this? And those answers start to give us a little glimpse into why this is considered art. So when I ask this question of students and allow them to just speak out, I'll just be like, anybody, just throw it out there. What do you think? Often I'll get an answer such as,
maybe they just wanted it to look nice.
And yeah, that makes 100% perfect sense, right? It makes perfect sense. If I'm a prehistoric human being living in 7500 BCE, maybe I'm just tired of everything around me looking the same, right? Or maybe whatever, maybe just I have this one piece of ochre and maybe I just want it to look pretty. I want it to look different. I want something around me that I can enjoy looking at. So I'm going to scratch this pattern into it, right? And that is a reason to make art, to beautify our environments. Another response I'll often get from students is,
maybe the markings have a religious or spiritual significance.
And that makes a lot of sense to me too, right? Like, we have no way to know what sort of spiritual beliefs the people of South Africa in 77 or 75,000 BCE may have had, but it is perfectly reasonable to say perhaps there was some sort of spiritual or religious meaning that was imparted by making these marks onto this object, right? Maybe by putting this particular set of markings, I have imbued this piece of ochre with some sort of spiritual significance. Maybe I have empowered this piece of ochre in some way, right? And that's a reason to make art. We're going to see over the course of this semester, and honestly in humanities too as well, just how much of the art that has been made by human beings is based in the religions of the cultures that made those works of art. So it makes perfect sense. Another answer that students will often give to this question is,
Maybe the person who made this wanted others to know that it belonged to them.
and that's always one of my favorite answers, right? Yeah, because like maybe, just maybe, what we're looking at here is, I don't know, a logo. That's a very modern concept, a modern term, right? But the idea could still apply, right? If I, in my community, 77,000 years ago, provide the best blocks of ochre in my community, right? And I want people to know that they're getting the best quality, right? That if they are getting ochre for whatever that purpose is, that they have gotten it from me, the best of the best. And so I put these markings on it so that a person who gets that has something that shows that it came from me. When someone else sees that cake of ochre that someone else may have, they can say, hey, where did you get that? Well, you see these markings here? This came from so-and-so. And it might just be maybe in 75,000 BCE, I am tired. I am sick and tired of every time I get myself a new piece of ochre, someone steals it from me. You know? And I'm like, you know what? Damn it, I am sick of this. I'm going to make sure that I know this is mine so that when I see it in someone else's hands, I'll be able to know who took it. So I scribe this into it, right? Scratch, so that I know it belongs to me. So that if I see someone later on who has this piece of ochre.
Yeah, hi, excuse me. Isn't that my ochre I see you using there? Hmm? No. This is mine. I don't know what you're talking about. I've had this the whole time. Oh yeah? Well then, why does it have my name on it, Eric?
Now, of course, I'm being silly, but that isn't to say that there wasn't at least some sort of analog for what that experience is like for us, for whoever it was that made the markings on this particular piece of ochre. And again, that's a reason to make art. And so, again, there's no way that we can know 100% for certain why whoever it was that carved these markings into this piece of ochre did that very thing. There's no way for us to know for certain. However, it did mean something to that individual. Whoever that was, it meant something to them. They wanted to communicate some sort of idea, whether it was making things look beautiful, whether it was imbuing some sort of spiritual meaning, or it was just making sure that we understand that this belongs to me, right? Or any other myriad of reasons that we could surmise could be the reason for doing this. In every case, there is something internal that the person creating this wants to express externally for others to understand. And to a certain extent, and in a very real and very present manner, that person has done that very thing with us all these 77,000 years later. We are having, in some ways, a very literal conversation with the person who made this. And having a moment in discussing like why, what could the possible reasons for making these things, making these markings have been, right? We see for a moment that maybe we're not so different from the person who did this. And now all that time, all those tens of thousands of years have just been compressed. And we are having this little moment that is very intrinsic to what art is, right? We're having this little moment where even though there is someone who feels like they're so far removed from us, someone that we couldn't possibly have anything in common with, and we learned that we're not all that different. And we learned, because of the nature of just how long ago this was made and the reasons why it potentially could have been made, we discover that art and the expression of, again, internal ideas and thoughts in some sort of external manner is very intrinsic to what it is to be human. And that's a beautiful thing. It's one of the things that I absolutely love about art, is that no matter how much time passes between the time that a piece of artwork was made and the time in which you, the person looking at the artwork, is alive, it is a very quick reminder that this particular piece was created intentionally by another human being who had thoughts and had ideas and had feelings and had spiritual inclinations, what have you, and felt the need to express them and show them to someone else. And I, in this moment, am that someone else. That's beautiful. And if it was happening 77,000 years ago, what has been happening in all those years since? Let's dive into that in part 2.